So we're here today to discuss how we can build small businesses and farmers' resilience to climate change. I'm Katherine Brown and I coordinate the Advans Group Climate Strategy. We're pleased to have with us today Olivier Bailly-Bechet, Advans Ghana CEO since 2018. Advans Ghana was the first Advans subsidiary to start working on our climate strategy in 2022, a project that is funded by our key historical partners, BII, EIB and FMO. Hi, Olivier.
Good afternoon, Katherine. Hi.
And we're also here with Juliette, CEO of Horus Development Finance since 2016. Horus has been supporting Advans with its climate risk evaluation and strategy for the past 2 years.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Olivier.
Hey.
So, why are we talking about climate change and financial inclusion today? African countries are among the lowest contributors to climate change, but they will be disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of anthropogenic global warming. We know that in these countries, more vulnerable populations like small businesses, farmers, and other low-income populations will be the most impacted. The current and future effects on African populations in general are numerous. Food security is going to worsen with the decrease of yield in agriculture. The availability of water for all uses is decreasing. There's a lot of health problems caused by the impact of climate change, with increased transmission of diseases, more deaths from extreme heat, and also climate disasters which are affecting the populations. And in cities, the exposure of infrastructures to climate hazards and sea level rise is going to affect and is already affecting several major cities. And of course, this has a negative impact on the economy and growth. And it's estimated that around 5 to 15% of GDP in African economies is already being lost to climate change. For our clients in Africa, and we will focus today on 3 markets, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tunisia, these impacts are already becoming a reality. In these countries, we support entrepreneurs who represent about 70% of the portfolio in number, and farmers, about 30%. We support various sectors of micro, small and medium enterprises with average loans at about €6,000 in these countries, with activities like grocery stores, clothes sellers, pharmacies, transport and schools. We also support a variety of farming activities which may differ according to the different countries. So we have, for example, animal breeding, poultry, cattle, goats and sheep, olives and cereal in Tunisia, cocoa and shea in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And the average loan size for farmers is slightly lower. It's about €4,000 in these countries. We provide these customers with loans and other financial services to help them grow and to develop their businesses for the future, aiming to help them increase their financial health, improve their living conditions, as well as drive the growth in the local economy and create jobs. But the increasingly present climate risks and the shifts in climate that are accelerating means that it may become more and more difficult to support the development of these customers because of the potential impacts both acute and chronic climate risks will have on their businesses and their livelihoods. That is why we want to act now to better understand these risks and take them into account in our operations, looking for both opportunities to better serve our clients and to help them better adapt to the impacts of climate change that are increasingly present today. So Juliette, Horus has been supporting Advans on how to integrate climate risks into its operations. Can you tell us a little bit about where you started? How can we start to look to understand these risks that financial inclusion clients are facing today?
Yes, sure. So our objective was to develop a methodology for Advans so as to assess which climate risks were most impacting the zones where Advans clients are operating and the sectors in which Advans clients are working in. Of course, we looked at international frameworks and methodology, but it really appeared necessary to adapt the methodology to really have something practicable and meaningful in a microfinance context. We started by selecting the climate hazards that occurred or were likely to occur most in advanced countries through the analysis of publicly available data. So this led to select different hazards, including all types of floods, so river floods, coastal floods, and flash floods, which typically occur when there is a sudden prolonged heavy rainfall and when the ground is too dry. We also looked at water stress. This is the availability of water on the whole for the population. And also extreme heat, wildfires, and landslides. Then we mapped these risks according to the zones where Advans clients were located, taking the situation today, but also the situation in the future, the horizon between 2030 and 2040. And then for the projection, so we discussed with Advans which scenario we should take into account. And after discussion, we decided to take the worst case scenario, which is the IPCC 8.5 scenario, which estimates what the climate change impacts would be if nothing is done, mainly because this will enable us to have the full view of the potential risks. We then assessed the level of vulnerability of a client's activity to each of these hazards in terms of revenue and of assets or impact on their assets. So therefore, we chose around between 10 and 15 sectors to look into in depth according to their level of exposure in the portfolio, aiming to cover about 70 to 80% of Advans activity in each country overall. So the vulnerability assessment was then done through in-depth individual interviews and business visits with at least 5 clients per sector, and then also workshop with Advans staff to discuss the perception of the risks and also adaptation strategy that clients were implementing. So to give some examples, if a zone is heavily impacted by water stress, then this will more likely have an impact on the revenues of an agricultural activity which requires a lot of water, rather than on a commercial activity like selling clothes, which doesn't require any water at all. Or, for example, a flood could severely impact any business which has a lot of unprotected stocks or assets, typically food stores, for example. One of the things we noticed when comparing the results between Ghana and Tunisia was that the risks were not necessarily the same per sector in these two markets. For example, if you take grocery stores in Tunisia, they are more vulnerable to local climate impacts because they source their goods locally and had a lot of fresh produce, whereas in Ghana, most of their produces were imported from abroad, and was typically they were mostly selling dry and tinned goods, which are less sensitive. So this gave us a picture of the exposure and then the vulnerability. So exposure depends on the location of the clients, and the vulnerability mainly depends on the business sector. And by combining the two factors, we were able to score the risks clients were facing.
And in terms of client resilience, how did you take that into account?
We were able to assess client resilience through the field study. And we found out that although clients did not necessarily recognize or understand the causes of climate change, several clients had already been impacted and adapted to certain climate impacts. For example, one hairstyle and beauty client had been affected by a flood last year and had already experienced one in 2018. The area where her shop was is often flooded, so she was thinking in the long term of relocating. She told us that water came inside her shop, around 10 centimeters, and deteriorated the walls. She had some paper boxes on the floor, the boxes were damaged, but not the products inside. Since this flood, to avoid further damages, she told us that she had raised her fridge on a pallet and she bought a glass shelf to put products in. This kind of small adaptation is quite common for small businesses in Ghana, but it often only comes after a major event. And some clients were struggling to keep their business going after flood damage. So another example from Tunisia, we had one olive grower who talked to us about the fact that local species were able to better survive dry conditions than important species, which use at least 3 times more water. With imported olive trees dying if you do not use irrigation to water them during the hot season, while local species survive even if not given water. He was cultivating 60% local trees already with 7 different types of olives. And he still kept imported trees because the yield is slightly better. And we especially saw a lot of this kind of adaptation techniques amongst farmers in Tunisia. So initially, we thought of devising a score on resilience, but it is difficult to do this in a consistent, standardized manner because it is more dependent on each client's behavior. That is something that can be integrated in the long term with, for example, specific questions during the loan application phase, for example. But at this stage, we found it difficult to score the resilience.
And what about transition risk? Were you able to take that into account?
Yes, transition risk is slightly harder to take into account. So we judge this according to the risk of rising costs for business or activities using a lot of electricity or transportation, for example, or changing regulation in the country, for example, new regulation on second-hand clothes in Ghana, or change in consumer demand. So these were the 3 parameters that we took into account to assess the transition risk. However, as a lot of customers' activities are informal and on a very small scale, and often in the economies we are looking at, there is not yet a significant shift in regulation towards sustainable economies. So it is difficult to judge the impact of certain aspects of global trends in the next 10 to 15 years on advanced client activities given the market where they operate.
Okay, thanks, Juliette. Very interesting last comment on the resilience of individual clients there, and interesting to hear the examples from the different countries. So, Olivier, for you, in terms of the analysis done in Ghana, what surprised you or marked you about the resilience of clients and the overall analysis that Horus did?
The analysis was very interesting because it's true that in most of the literature or the project, usually the focus is more on agriculture regarding to climate focus. But here we looked at the whole portfolio, which in Advans Ghana is predominantly made of urban clients, even though we have a share of agric clients too. It was essential for us to take into account the risk for clients in urban zones as well. So I would say that looking at the key hazards our clients are exposed, the fact that floods and especially flash floods was the main risk identified was not really a surprise because we already had quite a number of events in some of our branch affecting our clients in the past. And in Ghana, around 40,000 people are impacted by floods every year. But what was perhaps more surprising is to which extent our portfolio is already exposed to this risk of flash floods, because we have already 25% of our clients vulnerable to this risk, and this risk might even increase to 30% in the future. Extreme heat was also present in terms of risk, especially for the northern part of Ghana in Tamale, where we have a branch. So here there are different aspects in terms of impact and risk, I would say. Of course, one direct risk is the clients in agriculture that can be directly impacted in their production, transformation, It is about perishable product, but also in the areas where agriculture is the predominant activity. This can have a ripple effect on the economy of these zones, affecting even non-agric clients. In terms of vulnerability, we have seen that agriculture and animal breeding sectors are the most vulnerable to climate risk, which is not surprising, as well as all the sectors linked to agriculture, like sale of perishable products. If we look at the broader picture, this really raises a key concern from an agric financing perspective, because in our countries, in Africa and Ghana especially, agriculture is clearly identified as a very high potential sector, but it is also the highest exposed sector to climate risk. So the question of how do we address that and how do we de-risk working in this sector is very critical from a climate change perspective for financial institutions. What was interesting is that we also saw that in some service sectors like restaurants, they are quite vulnerable, especially due to the importance of fixed assets, stocks, and also the fact that they use a lot of energy for refrigeration, cooling, for example, and they also use a lot of water. They are particularly exposed. In terms of stock vulnerability also, close sellers in Ghana are particularly vulnerable due to the fact that most often it's very micro informal businesses doing this activity, and usually they keep most of their stocks directly on the ground. So in case of flash floods, for example, they are particularly vulnerable. There is also, Juliette mentioned it, the risk of a change in regulation, because it's mostly a second-hand clothing activity, which could be impacted by a change in regulation in Europe or US, where these clothes are coming from, but also here in Ghana, because they create also a lot of pollution. As Juliette also mentioned it, what was interesting is to see that some of our clients are already adapting to climate risk, even though they don't always, they are not always very aware that the risk was directly linked to the phenomenon of climate change. But at least it's the first positive sign of their resilience. But definitely we can't say the same for all our clients, and that's why it's very important to have a coherent overall response to build awareness on adaptation for our clients, and in some cases give them the financial means to adapt to these changes.
Thanks, Olivier. That's really interesting on the point on client resilience. So what do you think going forward? How do you think that Advans can support its clients better to build their resilience for the future?
Indeed, it's a very important question, and I would say before our clients, it starts with our staff, because they will be very key in implementing this climate strategy. They're on the field every day. They are the ones interacting with our clients, offering them financial services, advising them, supporting the development of their businesses. So it's very important that our staff are already well aware and trained about climate change risk and how it is really a business matter and not just a corporate social responsibility matter. So that's why we have started to engage our staff for some months in Advans Ghana, first by doing a survey to assess the level of awareness on climate change. 81% of our staff said that they had noticed some first impact of climate change in Ghana over the past few years. And we have also started to raise awareness on what are the causes and the consequences of climate change, so that our staff are at the same level of understanding. And for this, we are using the climate risk approach, which is an interactive 3-hour workshop where we discuss extensively the cause and consequences of the climate change. So far, we have already trained almost 300 of our staff in Ghana. We will continue to train all of them by the end of this year, and to develop capacity building tools to support the development of expertise of our staff. For example, how to analyze climate risk for a client, and how to talk to our clients about potential risk which may impact their business. We have started to introduce a few questions on climate in the client loan appraisal form. So we can see on an individual client basis those who have already been impacted by a climate hazard, and if they have done anything to increase their resilience. We are also starting to pilot some client awareness actions with a campaign that we have just launched in some branches in Accra and on Facebook to warn small businesses clients about the occurrence of floods, especially flash floods, and give them a few tips on how they can stay alert and prepare their business in case of emergency. For example, very simple tips like listening to a weather forecast, putting stock on shelves or in a safe place, unplug electrical equipment when you don't use them, make sure that the drainage system outside of your shop is clean and safe. All these things are very simple, but helps to reduce the risk. And we are testing this at a small scale for now this year, and aiming at fully rolling out this approach across our geography locations in Ghana in the years to come. Going forward, I would say that we want to start looking at what products we could offer to clients to respond to this climate issue, which may include some specific product modification in case of a climate emergency, like rescheduling of loans, grace period, emergency loans, or specific savings that can be mobilized and adapted loans for recovery. We may also look at opportunities to enable our clients to invest in adaptation in the long term. For example, loans for energy efficient equipment to reduce costs and promote green solutions, or to reinforce infrastructure in case of flood, or to proof business from extreme heat, for example. So we will look to develop products that can respond to the needs of a maximum number of clients and have the most impact. Generally speaking, also one important aspect in the future is to develop partnership with NGOs, partners that are involved in climate awareness, or that could be able to deliver non-financial service around climate change risk, so that we can leverage on that to reach more people and have more impact in the long term. So the risk analysis is just a starting point, and now we have to see how we can best support our clients in the face of climate change going forward.
Thank you very much, Juliette and Olivier, for sharing your expertise on the climate topic. We're currently performing the portfolio analysis in Côte d'Ivoire, and we will look to use the methodology developed by Horus for other subsidiaries in the future. As Olivier said, the risk analysis is just a start, and going forward, we will look to support our clients on pillars 3 and 4 of our overall strategy, namely aiming to build their awareness and adapt their products and services to their future needs. We are actively looking for both financial and operational partners to pursue these goals together, to find lasting solutions to build small businesses and farmers' resilience in the face of climate change. Thank you.